Hello and welcome to another discussion focused on Azerbaijan and the Southern Caucasus. I'm Dr. Joanne Lasowski, author and journalism educator. Today we are joined by American author, academic, journalist, and adventurer, Dr. Thomas Goltz, who is best known for his book-length accounts of conflict in the post-Soviet Caucasus. Most famously, Azerbaijan Diary, published in 1998. And good morning and welcome, Dr. Goltz.
Please.
Okay, Thomas. Your book, Azerbaijan Diary, is rich and full of accounts of the First Karabakh War. You delve deeply into politics, personalities, culture, and the economics of oil and gas. And it's just a lively writing. If anybody hasn't read it yet, I highly recommend that they look at it. It's now 2020, and we are talking about the Second Karabakh War. How does the second war compare to the first?
Well, first of all, I would like to say or make a few comments on the Azerbaijan Diary and its reception in the United States and indeed the world. It's also been translated into Turkish and Azerbaijani now, although some say that the translation is a little bit dubious, be that as it may. The other day, I just received out of the blue an extended email from a lady by the name of Nativan, who lives in Texas. She's half Azerbaijani, half Ukrainian, obviously living in diaspora, but was raised in Baku. And it was one of these really heartfelt notes that no review in the New York Times or the Washington Post or a specialized journal could possibly match this sort of thing, where someone from Azerbaijan says, "You found us." In other words, that this opportunity that I had back in, call it 1991 to 1995 or 96, which is the period that the book covers, was a journey of discovery that I did not waste. A lot of Azerbaijanis, when they heard that I was writing a book or that I'd come out with a book on Azerbaijan, said, "Oh, what could an American journalist tell us about us?" Well, apparently that American journalist, me, managed to find a real sense of Azerbaijan that Azerbaijani citizens appreciate even more so than any State Department individual tuning up for a tour of Azerbaijan. And that really, really moves me. I just thought I would say that, and I would say thank you to all the Azerbaijanis who assisted me in writing our book about this very, very difficult period of time, the rebirth of Azerbaijan following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So, Sağ olun, var olun is what I want to say to all those Azerbaijanis. Much of the book, as you suggested, deals with the horrible first war in Karabakh. We can debate when it really began. Some say 1988, some say 89, some say 90, following Black January in Azerbaijan. I was not there at the time. I first entered Soviet Azerbaijan in the summer of 1991. By that time, the war was starting to really take off, or it was evident to me when I was making an inspection of the Karabakh region that things were going downhill fast. That's when I made my first journey to a place called Khojaly, when I first went to Shusha, and I went to various other places in Karabakh where the tension was palpable. At that time, the Azerbaijanis really didn't have anything approximating an army. Why should they? They were a Soviet republic at the time. And so it was internal forces called the Aman who were there in and around Karabakh trying to allegedly keep the peace but not really doing a very good job of it. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Red Army also collapsed, as well as the ON structures that were in place. And so desertion was common among non-Azerbaijani forces who were stationed in Khankendi, Stepanakert, and elsewhere in the region. They would sell off their equipment, ranging from Kalashnikovs to APCs, or armored personnel carriers, that would then leak into the hands of Armenian militia forces at work inside of Karabakh. It was chaotic at the time, and almost ridiculously dangerous, because you could do anything as a correspondent, or almost anything, if you had the nerve to get into various situations, talking your way across the lines, back and forth, getting into situations, for example, like Khojaly. I was last in Khojaly aboard a helicopter on the invitation or the challenge of the local commander in Khojaly, the airport colonel, a gentleman by the name of Alif Tadjiev. He was later killed on the night that the Khojaly massacre happened, along with lots and lots of other people as well. But he could, I ran into him again in Agdam in January 1992, and he challenged me to join him on a helicopter going back into Khojaly that had bullet holes in it. And bullet holes came from heavy machine gun fire shooting at the helicopter as a symbol of Azerbaijan authority that the Armenians meant to get rid of. It was foolishly dangerous for me to do this, but I felt that it was my obligation to rise to the challenge that Aleph had issued me, and went to Khojaly, and I suspect, the last foreigner there. Spent a few days and then got back on another helicopter with a body and a number of refugees trying to get out, and then back to Agdam. Just as an example of how crazy, dangerous, and chaotic Azerbaijan was at that time. It was not dangerous, but certainly chaotic in the Azerbaijani parliament, where there were fistfights between the various factions, called them the remnant Communist Party members and the Popular Front, as well as others. There were the Islamists, there were the pro-Moscow faction, there was the pro-Turkish faction, there was the pro-Iranian faction as well. It was, as I say, ridiculously chaotic, but for a guy taking notes and learning as he was going on, it was a fantastic experience. And once again, I would like to think that I managed to capture the spirit of the times. Back to the comparison between the Second Karabakh War and the First Karabakh War, well, it was obviously night and day. The first thing that should be terribly obvious to anybody taking a look at those 44 days was that Azerbaijan actually had an army that was trained, an army and an air force, including, of course, the various drones that were used in the conflict that had been acquired from either Turkey or from Israel, as well as the individuals using those drones with great precision. It was an astounding victory for Azerbaijan that a lot of people did not predict and still have not gotten used to. One of the things that was predictable, I guess, was the coverage of that conflict by the international media, which I found sorely wanting for the most part. The almost knee-jerk response of NGOs and peacemaking outfits of calling for an immediate ceasefire and going back to the negotiations that had been agreed to in Madrid, Spain, back in, I think it was 2009, that the Armenians never uh, seemed to want to fulfill. So that when Azerbaijan struck this blow at great expense, I forget the total number of dead soldiers now, but it is almost 2,700, 2,689 or something like that. Great expense to Azerbaijan. But the soldiers and the Azerbaijani army went forward with resolve and managed to achieve this great historic victory, leaving Armenia and Armenians worldwide reeling in defeat and confusion. So we'll see what happens in the future, that there's maybe predictably the forest brethren still around places like Khojavend and Hadrut inside Karabakh. I mean by that Armenia militiamen or elements of the Armenian National Army that stayed behind. There was a shootout just, I think, yesterday or the day before, where one Azerbaijani soldier was killed, and 6 of these forest brethren, I call them, were also eradicated. How long that will go on, I don't know. But once again, it's a very delicate situation in this post-war period, and predictably delicate. Azerbaijan, as you know, has been officially encouraging remnants of the Armenian civilian population to remain behind and become good citizens of Azerbaijan. We'll see if that is possible or not. But this is the period of time where Azerbaijan has the opportunity to somehow re-include this population into this fantastic experiment that is modern Azerbaijan, which is multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, forward-looking, and what I find personally, warts and all, to be a very, very exciting experiment in state building.
That was a great summation of the differences between the two wars. Thank you, Thomas. That was wonderful. I want to talk a little bit about the U.S. reaction. You hinted at it a bit when you talked about the international media reaction, and I want to get to that a little bit later. And the war played out pretty one-sided here in the United States. I suspect it was due to the powerful Armenian diaspora in and about the U.S. and in U.S. government. And it was capped by a House bill, Resolution 1165, and condemning Azerbaijan and Turkey. And your reaction was to write about Article 907 of the 1992 Freedom Support Act. Your remark was directed, I think, to the president-elect, and you said, shame on you and shame on me. Tell us a little bit more about your reaction to the U.S. reaction.
Well, I do not belong to a political party. And I certainly was not a supporter of Donald Trump in this election and the previous election as well. Although I did not find it that surprising that he was elected the last time around for a variety of different reasons that we need not go into. I was obliged, because of my anti-Trump sentiments, which are deep and abiding, to vote for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Sometimes I was about to use a rather graphic description of that, but we can just skip that and go on. So I cast my ballot, and almost a day later, Biden and Harris came up on official stationery, calling or suggesting very strongly that their administration would reimpose the rigor of 907, which was passed in 1992, that had all manner of restrictions on government-to-government aid to Azerbaijan. At the time, Azerbaijan in 1992, 93, 94 was on its back as a result of the losing war with Armenia over Karabakh. And so good thinking Americans and, everybody from the Red Cross to the International Rescue Committee who take American government money, at least in part, were restricted from giving any sort of aid to the refugees and IDPs inside of Azerbaijan. There were literally piles of aid and medicines and that had been brought in from other sources that were left in fields out in the rain and the snow because the American government could not afford, was restricted in donating tarps or repairing buildings that these various materials could be housed in for the IDPs and the refugees inside of Azerbaijan. I had a very interesting conversation with former Ambassador Richard Kozlerich. This is some years ago when I was doing a program of Azerbaijan through Foreign Eyes, and I was interviewing all of the ambassadors who had served in Azerbaijan. And Rich told me because he served 1994 to 1996 during the height of the imposition of Article 907 and the aftermath of the war. He described his position as being the ambassador with one hand tied behind his back. That was the situation then. Obviously, with the signing of the deal of the century and the exploitation of first oil and now gas, Azerbaijan has made a lot of money out of Caspian energy resources and used those funds to build up its army and to purchase the drones used in the Second Karabakh War with such great effect. So the question is, and has been for some time, does Azerbaijan need American aid of any sort? And the answer to that is probably not. So Article 907 has become this symbolic thing. And the threat to reimpose the rigors of 907 in its original form are probably meaningless right now, but send a very clear signal of American naivete and indifference, I would say, to Azerbaijan and indeed the region as a whole, and sending this signal of American kowtowing to local politics inside the United States, namely the lobbies, the Armenian lobby in this case, but there are other lobbies as well. This is unfortunate, and I find it personally, as an American citizen, scandalous that our foreign policy will be dictated by uninformed, largely uninformed congressmen and their aides who are subject to the lobbying efforts of groups like the Armenian Assembly and others in Watertown, Massachusetts, or Glendale, California, or Dearborn, Michigan, etc. I find it scandalous, sadly. Others would argue that this is just the way that politics have always been run within the United States. Basically, well, sadly, I call it legalized corruption, where you can buy and sell a congressman or a senator to have them put a piece of legislation, a rider, so that, for example, maybe there's a piece of legislation dealing with the environment of Yellowstone Park. But at the bottom of that piece of legislation, you have something that ticks on extra aid for Armenia or even for Karabakh itself this was done, even though this Karabakh obviously is part of Azerbaijan, and so that this sending aid to the Armenian population of Karabakh at the time was theoretically illegal, but it got done anyway. So back to your question about what is the difference between the Karabakh War #1 and Karabakh War #2. The sheer level of firepower involved, the sheer level of organization involved, that was a huge difference. But it's also, and we're waiting to see right now how it plays out internationally. Right now, the United States, France, and others are trying to get back in the game, but Vladimir Putin of Russia has dealt himself very thoroughly back into the game and has troops on the ground in Azerbaijan, and for the first time since 1992, or 93, I beg your pardon, when the Russian forces stationed in Ganje were removed, that led to the revolt against Abu Fazl and all the stuff that I cover in my book. What the new Russian role in the South Caucasus is going to be, and what the new Turkish role in the South Caucasus is going to be. Will these two large players come into friction, or will they create some sort of condominium? How much independence will Azerbaijan be able to maintain in this environment? These are all good questions, and I have speculations about this, but I don't have any good answers at this point. That's above my pay grade, and you should ask other individuals like Matt Bryza and Rod Stokai and Paul Gogol about those issues, as opposed to my little self in my compound here in Montana.
Yes, but you do have great insight, so I appreciate that you're sharing them with us. In Azerbaijan Diaries, you wrote a great deal about how international news is covered and reported. And you've kind of hinted at it already, but what do you think about the war coverage of this war?
Well, once again, during the war, there was precious little coverage, particularly from the Azerbaijani side, and there was a reason for that. The government of Azerbaijan, the Ministry of Defense of Azerbaijan, managed to effect real restrictions in the combat areas. That, as I recall, certain Turkish television crews were allowed to travel with the Azerbaijani army as it was going forward in the southern part of mountainous Karabakh. But generally speaking, the coverage that was coming out, and not surprisingly very sympathetic to Armenia, was of correspondence that the Armenians were allowing in or even encouraging to come in to Armenia, as well as Karabakh, to hang with the boys on the front. And so that was the sort of reporting that was happening in the New York Times and elsewhere. Once again, not surprisingly, it was tended to be rather sympathetic to the Armenian side for all sorts of historic reasons, but all these cliches began to reappear in the media. They're cliches that I've been fighting against for, 20 years. The terms of reference that were being used, that Karabakh was an enclave, for example. Mm-hmm. Karabakh never was an enclave, because it was always part of Azerbaijan. An enclave is a country or a part of a country that is completely surrounded by another one, like Lesotho or the Vatican, for example. By definition, enclaves in the world are rather rare. They tend to disappear. They tend to be absorbed by the country around them. And they tend to attract sympathy as well, because they're surrounded. So long as the Armenians were able to get the international media to use that loaded word enclave, they had won half the battle, as it were. The other thing that obviously they like to stress was that the Christian nature of Armenia, the world's so-called first Christian country, whether that's true or not, the Georgians would dispute that with the Armenians. And to cast Azerbaijan as a Muslim country. This was done very, very effectively in the First Karabakh War. And once again, in the Second Karabakh War, there was that effort to make that happen. One of the things that also almost immediately came up, and I don't have all the facts in the matter, but the allegation that Azerbaijan, through Turkey, was bringing in Syrian, quote-unquote, mercenaries to use as cannon fodder on the front lines. I've never seen a body of these alleged mercenaries. I find it very, very dubious. Why would Azerbaijan bring in presumably Sunni Muslim fundamentalist or fundamentalist leaning mercenaries from Syria when it has its own army made up of not only trained troops with a chain of command that obviously mercenaries would have nothing to do with. But it was notable, shall we say, that this allegation came up and was repeated again and again, often at very high levels of government. I believe that President Macron of France was even used this allegation in his country's support for Armenia as well as the Karabakh Armenians. Happily, when the conflict started to come to an end, the New York Times and my dear friend Carlota Gall, who wrote a book about Chechnya and also Afghanistan and elsewhere, did some very, very excellent reporting. And prior to her arrival in Baku, we had an extended conversation, and I begged her to beg her desk not to use this word enclave in her reporting. And I'm pleased to say that at least when she was having solo pieces and not joint bylines, that the word enclave did not appear in connection with Karabakh, but rather, disputed territory, disputed district, or just district or territory. The other thing that I have fought against for years is the use of the word Nagorno. Nagorno or Nagorny is merely a Russian adjective that means mountainous, right? And if we're speaking in Russian, we can use Nagorny as often as we want. But when we are speaking in English or other languages, to use a Russian adjective that nobody understands only mystifies the nature of the conflict. Thus, I insist on using the word mountainous Karabakh or upper Karabakh, because that defines the larger Karabakh region, meaning that there is a mountain, an upper part, and there is also the valley. And if we go back to the original Karabakh War of 91 to 94, most of the IDPs and refugees inside of Azerbaijan were coming from Valley Karabakh. And indeed, I've noted with great approval that increasingly individuals are no longer using the outdated word Nagorno unless they're speaking or writing in Russian, but rather either Karabakh as a region as a whole, including both mountain and valley Karabakh, or defining what Azerbaijan managed to retake during the Second War as being the southern part of mountainous Karabakh, or the large swaths of valley Karabakh that Armenia was in occupation of, namely Zengilan, Fizuli, Agdam, and Kelvija. and the other parts of non-mountainous Karabakh that the Armenians took over between 91 and 94. So there's been a shift now in the terms of reference. Hopefully, Azerbaijan can hold on to not only the territory, but also to the terms of reference of getting across the fact that that Karabakh never was an enclave, and that Karabakh, the conflict itself, is not a Muslim, Christian, or religious conflict, but rather a purely territorial one, and that that's the way it should be looked at.
I very sincerely appreciate your precision in language. It's so important in conflict reporting, and it's often not even addressed. And you can really, when you start doing research on conflict reporting, you can pick out particular words that are very aggressive instead of being passive. And it's, I mean, and just the precision that you are attending to is just wonderful to hear. And I wonder, you mentioned Carlotta Gall from the New York Times. And is there anyone else, as a journalist and writer yourself, is there any single person or organization that did the worst or the best job in covering the conflict? What were you paying attention to besides the New York Times?
I found the coverage in the British media, and particularly The Guardian, to be sadly wanting, that they dipped into every cliche, enclave, Christian, Muslim, etc., to the point where I ceased reading The Guardian as a result. One of the publications that I religiously, as it were, read and read every week is the Armenian Weekly, which is actually kind of a Dashnot publication here in the United States, but just to keep a finger on the pulse of what the Armenian diaspora is thinking. And there was some rather outrageous stuff that came down, including a suggestion at one point of, using the scrap atomic particles from the Metsamor reactor outside of Yerevan and bombing Baku. I mean, ridiculous. And one needs to dismiss that sort of thing out of hand, and not to exaggerate it as being mainstream Armenian thinking about, the Third War or something. Much more interesting, and I'd like to get into this a little bit. I hope that my old acquaintance, Gerard Liberadian, has an impact on Armenian thinking, not only in Armenia, but also in the diaspora. Gerard, who was at least teaching at the University of Michigan, I'm not sure if he still has classes or not there, was, of course, the chief advisor on foreign policy of Mr. Terpetrosyan, the first president of independent Armenia, who was forced to resign basically over Karabakh because he would not take as hard a line as some of the other individuals in Armenia. Anyway, years ago, and actually the last time I saw Gerard, there was a conference at Harvard that I was attending, and Gerard was there as well. I had just come out with my book on Azerbaijan, and I would like to think that I gave him a copy. He had just come out with his own book on Armenia, which, as I recall, its title was Armenia, the Challenge of Statehood. A brilliant little book. And what the essence of what he was writing was saying was that we can either live in the physical Armenia that emerged from the Soviet Union, or we can try to live in the Armenia of our imaginations. he was addressing particularly the diaspora groups in California and Massachusetts and elsewhere, the maximalists who were saying, that half of eastern Turkey should be Armenia, along with reparations. That southern Georgia, Jabakheti, should be part of Armenia as well. And his point being that if we really want to be a modern state in the world, we have to get along with our neighbors. And by that, he was meaning very specifically Azerbaijan and Turkey. That without having open borders with these two states, let alone Georgia to the north or Iran to the south, there's no way that Armenia can possibly be a modern, prosperous, forward-looking state and a member of the international community. At the end of the Second Karabakh War, to his great credit, and speaking volumes about his courage, Girard came out with the same argument and said, we really need to clean house and clean the cobwebs out of our heads and start talking with our neighbors, not our enemies, but our neighbors, namely Armenia or Azerbaijan, and very specifically Turkey. Whether this will result in a sea change in Armenian political opinion, particularly in the diaspora, I don't know. I just find that particularly given the magnitude of the disaster for Armenia of the Second Karabakh War, that for Girard to come out and say this openly and call upon his compatriots in Armenia and also in diaspora was an act of real courage, and I do hope that the Armenians will act upon his wise words.
Yes, he has been someone of great interest to me that I have been following and would love to talk to him sometime soon, I hope. I want to talk a little bit about Turkey's role and how much hysteria there was in Russia and the West about Turkey helping or in any way supporting Azerbaijan. What do you think are the reasons of such terror? And do bring up your most recent book on Turkey as well.
Yeah, let's start there. Here we go.
So as a Turkey expert, why do you think the Turkey Diaries, why do you think that the West was just so terrorized by Turkey's role and support of Azerbaijan?
I wouldn't use the word terrorized. There certainly was a reaction. Mm-hmm. And with the familiar calls for restraint, etc. Part of that reaction was the growing sense that Azerbaijan was winning, and that Azerbaijan could not possibly win without Turkey, without Turkish drones, without Turkish mercenaries. Obviously, Turkey played a decisive role in the creation of the new Azerbaijani army and the use of drone warfare, which they say is being studied in military academies throughout the world, and even to the point where it's saying that this war and the use of drones has made the tank obsolete. We'll see about that. So that Turkey clearly played a decisive role in the creation of the Azerbaijan modern army and air force, but I don't see how Turkey played a decisive role in the fighting on the ground. No, not at all. My sense of sitting back in Montana and trying to follow this as closely as possible, was that Azerbaijan could not be given credit for defeating the invincible Armenian forces that were stationed in Karabakh for some 25 years, building up their levels of defensive trenches and such like, which were just so easily, not easily, which were overrun at considerable cost to Azerbaijan, but not as it was not the obviously not the disaster that a lot of people were predicting, as happened in 91, 92, 93, and 94. So that somebody had to be blamed for the Armenian disaster, and blaming Turkey was about as easy as a target as you could find, particularly given the recent politics in Turkey and the sliding popularity of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. I remember, and I write about this extensively in my book on Turkey. It has just recently come out. You can get it on Amazon.com. The honeymoon that happened with Erdogan in the early 2000s, when he came to power in 2003, even when he was the mayor of Istanbul prior to that, that the obsequious coverage of Erdogan at that time, mainly as a response to the Turkish military, which was fading from the scene, or at least was fading from popularity and being accused of non-democratic things, that the West needed to have a modernistic Muslim leader to use as some sort of symbol, and Erdogan became that individual and cultivated it with great assiduity. I remember once reading a profile of Erdogan, or maybe circa 2003 or 2004. It was one of those elections back then, where the New York Times reporter, or maybe it was the Washington Post, in doing this obsequious portrait of this modern Muslim guy, ended his report by saying that he even keeps a couple of beers in the refrigerator for special guests. Allegedly, I personally, I would doubt that, but that sort of detail that slipped into the reporting at the time of Erdogan keeping a couple of beers for that visiting correspondent in his refrigerator at home, and where we've gone from that to Erdogan being the new sultan, the creator of neo-Ottomanism, of doing this geopolitical overreach ranging from Libya to obviously Syria, Cyprus, and elsewhere. It is really breathtaking, the distance traveled. Now, how much of the beer in the refrigerator Erdogan ever really existed, and how much of the Sultan really exists today, is a very, very good question. And where Mr. Erdogan will be leading his country, particularly with this geopolitical overreach that everybody is talking about. Obviously, he's made certain geopolitical decisions. Some might be called mistakes. For example, of buying the Russian S-400 air system from Moscow and stationing that in NATO member Turkey. It gives the anti-Turkey individuals and voices in places like the United States and indeed France and indeed Europe lots of room to maneuver. But we have to remember also that one of the reasons that the Turks went for this Russian defense system, which is at odds with NATO policy, is that the United States and the Congress of the United States was playing footsie or refusing to sell Turkey the Patriot anti-aircraft systems that Turkey thought that it needed. Now, a guy like me, I'm actually kind of anti-military, or increasingly anti-military. One could ask why Turkey needed to have the Patriot anti-aircraft system in place on the Syrian frontier. Was Syria going to seriously send its air force into Turkish airspace, NATO member Turkey, so that Turkey needed to defend itself against a bunch of old MiGs? Who was Turkey going to be defending itself against? Why was it so essential for Turkey to have even more military equipment? I have a dear friend in Washington, D.C., who used to be a correspondent in Turkey. Now she's with the World Bank, wrote a book about the Kurds and Turkey's complex relationship with its own Kurds and Kurds outside of Turkey in Syria, northern Iraq, and elsewhere. But she tellingly either wrote or at least used in conversation with me an excellent anecdote, which was in Washington, D.C., Turkey does not have any friends, only defense contractors.
Interesting. And increasingly more and more refugees from Syria.
I don't think there are new refugees coming from Syria into Turkey at present. If anything, that flow is being encouraged to go in the other direction.
Okay.
To the situation in Erbil, the last holdout province.
Okay.
If one does not count Rojava, the Kurdish areas of northeastern Syria. Depending on what plays out in Erbil, we may see some more Syrian refugees coming into Turkey, but generally speaking, the flow is in the other direction. But one should not forget there's a huge number of Syrians in Turkey right now, around 3 million, etc.
Right.
I spent some time in not only in those areas of southeastern Turkey, of Gaziantep, Suruç, across from Kobani, the so-called Kurdish Stalingrad, inside of Syria, right across the frontier, as well as in Urfa. But I also spent a lot of time in Lesbos. I have a house in the Turkish town of Ayvalık, and that's like 10 nautical miles away from Lesbos. And so I go to Lesbos all the time. And one of the things that I was tracking was, I beg your pardon?
So we are now counting on you to give us more and more information about Turkey on a regular basis. So be prepared. I want to get back a little bit.
If they ever let me back in.
President Aliyev says that this is the end of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Do you agree?
Don't use that word. Mountainous Karabakh.
Mountainous Karabakh conflict. Do you agree?
I don't know.
Okay.
I sincerely hope so. But once again, and there are so many moving parts right now, and the primary moving part, of course, is the Russian attitude of what is happening there. Is Russia there to be a peacekeeping force between the victorious Azerbaijani army and the defeated Armenians, who should theoretically have all cleared out and gone back to territorial Armenia? Will Russia serve that purpose, or will Russia serve some sort of protection force of remnant elements of rebellious Karabakh Armenians as well as Armenians within Armenia itself. That's a hard call. I mean, Russia has played it a dubious game here and there before, in not only in Karabakh but obviously in Georgia, elsewhere, Ukraine. So the ink ain't dry yet in the Karabakh conflict. I do hope that that the peace holds, and that I do fervently hope that Azerbaijan continues down this path of truly trying to reabsorb the remnant Armenians inside of Karabakh, northern mountainous Karabakh at this point, and that they can become good citizens of the Republic of Azerbaijan in the future. It's going to be tough. It's going to require work, but and it's going to require international support of defanging the Armenian diaspora somehow or other, of making a concrete effort to bring these errant Armenians back into the larger society that is modern Azerbaijan. One of my dreams would be, as you probably know, that I made a film about the Karabakh Agdam football club or soccer club back in 2014 and then 2015 when the Horsemen got into the groups stage of the European Champions League. And I traveled with them to Italy, to France.
Oh, what fun.
And made this hour-long film about their journey. This football team, which could not play a home game because their stadium in Agdam had been destroyed and Agdam city occupied and indeed destroyed itself. One of the first telephone calls that I got from Azerbaijan during the conflict was from a supporter of the Karabakh Agdam football team saying, Thomas, we can now go and play back in Agdam.
That's great.
I nearly had tears in my eyes when the team went out there after the Armenians had withdrawn from Agdam city, and they went out to the destroyed football pitch, etc., hopefully having checked that it was not mined. And the guys were out there and kicking around the ball a bit, symbolically.
Well, it really demonstrates how powerful sports can be in bringing people together.
Well, that is my point. It was my guys who were back out in Agdam, symbolically kicking around the football like that. But when will we get to the point where the Armenians can muster up a Mannschaft, as we say in German and in international soccer talk, to get in an Armenian Mannschaft out of Helsinki or something, and play again in Agdam against the Karabakh Agdam Horsemen. Good. I would love to be at that match.
I'm sure that they will invite you. I'm sure that at least the Azeris will invite you. Do you think that 2020 changed the power balance in the South Caucasus forever?
I think that 2020, and particularly the war, has changed the power balance in the South Caucasus. I don't like that word forever.
Okay. Makes sense. Do you think it's wise that the Azerbaijani leadership is now distancing itself a little bit from the Minsk group?
I am not an expert on the intricacies of the Minsk group negotiations, but clearly the Minsk group has fallen flat on its face. The Minsk group being Russia, the United States, and France. The only active member of that negotiating group is the Russian Federation. Now France and the United States are trying to get back in the game. Will Russia let them? I don't know. But it is truly a disappointing thing to have had so much wasted effort, so much money, on hotel rooms and banquets, airline tickets, and flying here and flying there, with no result, or rather, with the result that Azerbaijan, and I find this ironic and almost poetic, that it was up to Azerbaijan to restore the territorial integrity of Azerbaijan in accordance with the 4 Security Council resolutions passed back in the 1990s, demanding Armenian immediate withdrawal from this territory or that territory, which never happened until Azerbaijan finally put paid to Armenian claims on this. How this plays out in the future, the Minsk group, etc., I cannot tell you. I just know that all of these groups, the International Crisis Group, the Minsk group, the European, whatever the European Council of Europe, its resolutions, its demands, its calling for this, its calling for that, have all become just moot points in the aftermath of this 44-day war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and victorious Azerbaijan. Anyway, I'm starting to lose my voice a little bit here.
I know, and I had one more question, and I was going to let you go. And I appreciate so much you spending the time with us. It's really been so insightful. But one more question. You can answer it shortly if you want to. Your first book on Azerbaijan was titled Requiem for a Republic to Be. Now, if you were to rewrite that book today, what's your title?
Well, first a correction. Requiem for a Would-Be Republic.
Okay.
The name of the book. And it was rewritten. It's called Azerbaijan Diaries.
Okay. So 1998 Azerbaijan Diaries, what's the 2000 version of that?
The 2020 version.
2020, right.
I have a number of different projects that are ongoing right now. I wrote a book-like object called The Oil Odyssey about this insane motorcycle trip that I organized in the year 2000 with the support of then President Haydar Aliyev, and because he thought it was a geopolitical stunt was what was needed to get the international oil people active about the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. So we had some fun with that, Haydar and I. I'm coming to the end of a reworking of that book, which is, it's not about Azerbaijan per se. It's about Azerbaijan, it's about Georgia, it's about Turkey, it's about oil, it's about adventures, it's about motorcycles. And the leitmotif of that book is, who says geopolitics can't be fun?
You could add soccer into that too.
That's another book that I need to retool. It's about the Karabakh Agdam horsemen. But there's another really odd book that I don't know if I'll get around to before I die, which is a pity. The working concept of that is Azerbaijan. That a friend of mine gave me that as a gift. And it's basically about the Azerbaijan that nobody really knows about. It's the Azerbaijan of culture and theater and opera, and my adventures in that sort of culture zone.
It's so rich. It is so rich in culture. I appreciated that so much when I lived there.
I made a habit of going to theater, dance, the opera every occasion that I could.
Me too.
While I was working on this film about the ambassadors in Azerbaijan, and I took copious notes on all of this. Often I was the only foreigner in these various performances. I got to know people like the late, great Rafik Eliyev, who was the head of the Actors Society in Azerbaijan. He passed away about, maybe 4 months ago or over the summer, not of COVID. We were very good friends, and he introduced me to all manner of actors and events that he was often performing in himself. And as I say, I would take copious notes on these performances. And then I started to think that maybe there was an odd little book, and I started to write it as if writing letters to Audrey Altstadt. Dear Audrey, because she has made a career about the serious study of Azerbaijani literature and theater, and so that using her as the target of my often naive writing about various cultural events and performances, and addressing my questions about said performances to her. There was this extraordinary performance about Javid, and that was the name of the performance. One performance only.
Oh, really?
And it was elements of all of his plays written back in the 20s and before he was sent off to Siberia to die in the 1930s at the National Drama Theater in Azerbaijan. And it was Rafik Aliyev, who called me and said, "Get down here now." And I got down there, and everybody else was dressed in furs, etc. But they let me in, and I was there with the Azerbaijani elite, the only foreigner in the audience. One of the few foreigners, I think, who could actually understand what was being said. And then there were all these friends of mine who were performing various roles on the stage of the various plays of Javid, just little snippets, 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. And I said, "Where's Rafi?" He was nowhere to be seen.
Oops. I think we've lost him. I think you are frozen. Oh, you might be frozen. Oh, you're coming back. We probably need to leave it at that, Thomas. And
no, I'm not going to leave it at that. I need to finish the sentence.
You're coming back.
On the balcony comes
he was out in the balcony.
Comes this booming voice.
It
was Rafik playing Mir Bagayev and dragging Javid off basically into exile in Siberia. It was just so moving, so moving. Anyway, that's my Azerbaijan, and that's the way I'm going to end our
Azerbaijan. Thank you so much for your wonderful insights and background into what Azerbaijan really is about. And your Azerbaijan Diary was a welcome respite for me to remember my time in Azerbaijan. And also, it was something I read before I went to Azerbaijan, so it gave me some real insight. So thank you for your time. And I hope to talk to you again soon, Thomas, because this has been a sheer delight. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank Sevinch as well.
Sevinch, Osmanqizi.
Holy, Alelek.